Il rencontre ensuite Steve Nesbitt, un Américain, assistant pasteur à Wattignies et professeur d'anglais, qui devient leur entraîneur. Puis tous ensemble, ils s'installent à Ronchin. De 15 licenciés à sa création en 1985, le baseball club ronchinois est passé à 60 joueurs. Effet de mode ou implantation réelle d'une nouvelle discipline dans la métropole, le baseball se fait entendre.
Well, that rather unusual excerpt is taken from a French newscast 20 to 25 years ago in northern France, depicting the baseball club that I helped to direct and coach, and in which I played as well. You know, whereas employing your world language skills and your world language learning to do something as obscure as coaching baseball in France is highly unusual. Nonetheless, there's one picture from this video that I'd like to focus on right now, because to me it typifies what world language instruction ultimately should have as its goal. It's this picture where I'm addressing the players just before our game against the Brussels Kangaroos. And as I look at this picture, I'm reminded of Mohamed and Jean-François and Fabrice and Maxime and Pierre-Yves and Pierre and Jérôme and Antoine and Samir, and the names just go on and on. The memories are rich, and those relationships were very important to me and remain really important to me to this very day. That's really what world language instruction should be all about, opening doors to relationships with people we would not be able to know otherwise. However, instead of opening doors, what if our mode of instruction as world language teachers is actually closing doors for our students to the possibility of their entering into meaningful relationships? What if our mode of instruction is actually training our students to think in a way which will render their world language study ultimately fruitless? Well, that's the conclusion that I came to after my first 3 years of world language teaching back in the late 1970s. The results of my work appeared totally fruitless to me. My students, as they were attempting to speak Spanish, I could perceive that they were merely speaking English using what they thought were the equivalent terms in Spanish that I had given them. They were thinking English and trying to speak in Spanish. And I'm confident that for the native speaker, their speech must have been largely unintelligible. During the summer of 1980, deeply discouraged over the results of those first 3 years of instruction and basically not wanting to continue in world language education, I prayed and asked God, how is it that people learn language? Because what I've been doing up to this point has been an utter failure. Then I decided I would throw out everything that I had assumed regarding how world language instruction should take place, based upon what I myself had observed as a student in the late 1960s and 1970s as I was learning French and then later Spanish. I started from scratch, and I decided that I would try to replicate the natural language learning process by which a person learns his or her native language, because 99.9% of the world's population is successful at learning to speak their own native language fluently. This led to me establishing 9 principles that summer that I would insist upon respecting, no matter how difficult or awkward it might seem from time to time in my world language classroom once I went back to teaching that next fall. And you can read about these principles in greater detail at my website, in the teachers section of the website, in a video called What is the ULAT World Language Program in a Nutshell. However, I'd like to make just a brief summary of those points to you right now. First of all, was the most important foundational principle. I determined that I would proceed in my instruction from listening and speaking for an extended period of time, months, to reading after some phonics instruction, and much later, after at least a year of instruction, to writing the language that the students were learning. I would, in other words, lay a strong oral foundation to their knowledge of this new language before I would ever introduce them to the printed word. Secondly, I would reject translation as a teaching tool altogether in the classroom. Thirdly, I would convey meaning visually to my students through mime, gestures, images, video clips, with no recourse whatsoever to printed text. Fourthly, I would assign representative gestures to the vocabulary my students were learning. For example, vivir, hacer, escuchar, lavar, decir, préparer, manger, aimer, regarder, mettre. The purpose of these gestures would be to convey meaning as the students would perform the gesture and say the word. The meaning was being very graphically conveyed without any recourse to their native language nor to printed text. Similarly, performing a motor activity as they were doing these gestures and saying these words greatly enhanced retention. And then finally, these gestures can serve as a prompt as well. When I saw that a student was stuck, but I knew what they wanted to say, rather than taking the initiative out of their hands or out of their mouth to form the statement that they wanted to say and telling them how to say it and making them simply repeat what I was saying. No, I left the initiative in their hands, and I would use a gesture to guide them to the word that they had temporarily forgotten. Fifthly, I determined that I would not present grammar in an analytical fashion, but I would rather develop linguistic reflexes in my students. That is, the ability to produce a certain structure within a limited time frame that did not allow them time for reflection in their native language. Sixthly, I determined I would prioritize substance over form during the first year in particular, initially affirming the validity of my students' expressions, provided that their messages were comprehensible, albeit grammatically faulty. Only gradually would I raise the bar regarding the form issue, the grammatical correctness of their statements. That would not be my emphasis at first. I wanted to build within them the confidence and the pride in essence in their own ability to speak the language. Seventh, I determined I would de-emphasize the irregular aspects of the language at first in order to build the students' sense that the language had some predictability to it, and therefore giving them the confidence to actually speak up in class. Eighth, I would develop highly objective means of oral testing to demonstrate to the students that I really meant business, that I really intended for them to speak this language that they were learning and not just be able to fill in blanks with vocabulary words or whatever. I wanted them to actually speak the language, and so the testing had to reflect that was my priority. And then ninth, I would create a highly objective means of evaluating and requiring oral participation. And I would weight oral participation extremely heavily in determining their grade, so that students understood that they had to be active learners and active participants in class discussion if they thought they were going to pass my class. I'd like to devote the remainder of this video to explaining what I call the natural language acquisition sequence. It's the sequence on which my ULET program is based, in fact. It begins with exposing students to a visual and auditory presentation of a word. Now, I can do that either by means of mime, which very commonly I do in the classroom, and then saying a word which corresponds to that which I'm acting out, or I can do it more simply, and I'll do it here in this particular video in this manner, by means of a video, showing the students a video clip.
Escuchar. Lavar. Decir. Salir. Caminar. Comer.
Secondly, I teach the students a gesture to perform whenever they say that word. For example, for the verb to work, or trabajar, or travailler. This is to work. The students perform this gesture as they say it.
Écouter. Laver. Dire. Salir. Caminar. Comer.
Well, after having exposed the students to a video clip or to mime conveying the meaning of a new word, and then teaching them a representative gesture that they're to perform, I select a key still image from that video clip, which will thereafter represent that word for the students in the course of the lessons that they will perform.
Vivir. Hacer. Escuchar. Lavar. Decir.
Fourthly, I place that still image in a sequence with other images with which they've already become familiar, and I associate that series of images with hyperlinked sound that corresponds to a complete sentence in order to demonstrate proper sentence structure. And they follow the images in the order of the sound file they're hearing, and thereby they learn. For example, let's take an object pronoun in Spanish. Yo te conozco muy bien. They would see an image like this, the first picture, and then the second picture would be the verb, which is conocer, and then the third picture would be the gesture of me doing this, which is the object pronoun te, or you, familiar, and then they would see an image, maybe something like this for very well. Muy bien. Yo te conozco muy bien. I know you very well. Je te connais très bien. And they would hear yo te conozco muy bien, and they would see the images. Their eyes would follow the images in this order. Yo te conozco muy bien. Or let's take another sentence like I prepare a meal for you. Je te prépare un repas. Yo te preparo la comida. Their eyes would follow the images in this sequence. Yo te preparo la comida, and in so doing, their deep understanding of the structure of the language is being laid without me having to tell them, place the indirect object pronoun before the conjugated verb of which it's a no. I place the words, therefore, in this images, I should say, in a sequence which will enable them to learn almost intuitively proper sentence structure.
Je te dis bonjour. Vous nous parlez en français. Tu me vends une voiture. Je leur achète de la glace.
And then once they can accurately predict proper sentence structure, and this is point number 5, I expose these students to a series of these images in a PowerPoint presentation, which gradually accelerates. The presentation accelerates because I don't want them eventually, at the end of it, to have the time at all to reflect in their native language. I want them to be able to create the sentence, to form the sentence as a reflex action and not as an analytical response to any grammar lessons that I've previously provided. No, I want them to be able to form these sentences as in what I call a linguistic reflex, a reflex response, not allowing them the time, the leisure to reflect in their native language, nor in terms of printed text, nor in terms of charts and grammar rules that they might have learned at some time in the past. Here you see, for instance, one such PowerPoint presentation. It's from lesson 3.19 that deals with demonstrative adjectives and possessive pronouns. You notice that after each of the colored screens that you have a different duration during which the student can form the statement. For example, after the green, they have 5 seconds in which to form the statement, which is suggested by the images on that particular screen. After the yellow screen, they have 4 seconds. After the red, they have only 3 seconds. So I'll just do some examples from each section so you can get an idea of the acceleration process. I'll do them in French or Spanish or possibly in English at the very end. Here we go. Cette chemise-ci est la tienne. Ce pantalon-ci est le sien. Ces chaussures-ci sont les nôtres. Cette ceinture-là est la vôtre. Ces chaussettes-là sont les siennes. Cette casquette-là est la vôtre. Now we'll go to the next section, the yellow section in Spanish now. Estos pantalones son míos. Esos calcetines son suyos. Estas botas son suyas. Ese cinturón es tuyo. Estos zapatos son suyos. One more. Esa gorra es mía. Now we'll go to the last section after the red screen. This is the fastest. They have but 3 seconds in which to form the sentence. I'll do it in English. That belt is theirs. These shoes are his. That hat or that cap is ours. I'll do it in French now. Ce pull est le mien. Cette cravate est la leur. Ces chaussettes-là sont les tiennes. Ces bottes-ci sont les siennes. Now in Spanish, este abrigo es suyo. Esos lentes son tuyos. Esos pantalones son suyos, etc. So you get the idea. They have very little time during which to form the statement as they finally get to the last section. Now number 6. At the same time that I'm developing linguistic reflexes in my students, I expose them to movies in the target language or engage in discussion about our mutual lives in a way that will maintain student interest and give them topics to discuss with me and on which they can practice these different linguistic reflexes, their oral expression. 7th, once I've determined that they have attained relative oral fluency, yes, next video, I promise I'll define it next video, within the limited scope of vocabulary and grammar with which they've been presented thus far, I'm willing to teach them to read, first building an understanding of the language's phonics system, and then exposing them to stories focusing on that particular vocabulary. Now, very important, because I've delayed the act of reading until they first have a sound oral foundation to their knowledge, the teaching of reading becomes exceedingly easy by comparison to what it would have been had I turned the whole process on its head. Now, this idea of turning the natural language learning sequence on its head is very important. It's essentially what we're doing when we present language in written form at the same time that we think we're ostensibly teaching our students to speak and understand speech. As the printed word is frozen in time, and since students are free to consider it at great length long before an oral foundation has been laid in their minds, the consequence is that they apply the English phonics system to its pronunciation, and to remember it, establish a one-to-one correspondence in their mind between that printed word and a translation of it in their native language. Now, by contrast, consider what has already transpired by the time a student arrives at this particular lesson, lesson 2.9 within the ULAT program. This particular lesson has been preceded by a first unit of over 50 lessons, entirely devoid of printed text, during which roughly 3 months of training and conversation have laid a sound oral foundation to their learning. This is the 5th lesson on phonics, presenting them with the 5th vowel sound in Spanish, namely the sound U.
Lu, you, mu, nu, nu.
After drilling this sound in combination with a variety of consonants, the students are then shown a PowerPoint presentation obliging them to pronounce syllables containing all the vowel sounds they've learned to that point, including the sounds generated by vowels appearing side by side, therefore 2 vowels at a time. Time is given for them to say the word or to say the sound, and then they hear its correct pronunciation.
U. No. Be. Iri.
Now, when the students arrive at the reading section of this lesson, found right here, containing the next excerpt of an ongoing story about a fictional family called the Richardsons, they can click on the word's individual syllables and hear the pronunciation.
Pa, pa, se, si, e, ta, e, la, sa, la, le, e, pe, ri, o, di, ko.
As well as click on a button allowing them to hear the sentence read to them fluently.
Papá se sienta en la sala y lee el periódico.
However, and this is the key, as they come to the point where they themselves are to read the entire brief paragraph aloud. Because reading instruction has been delayed for 3 months of intensive oral interaction, they have two distinct advantages over those students who are trained by use of the printed word. First, their reading comprehension is radically enhanced by the fact that they have already used these words in conversation a multitude of times. And please catch this, even if this text were not provided for them in printed form, and all they had was the picture at the top of the screen, they could very easily describe aloud what they see the man doing in the image above, because they have those sound oral skills already put into place. Secondly, their second advantage is that in addition to enhanced reading comprehension, the oral foundation that has been laid saves them from the trap of applying the English phonics system towards their reading for the first time. Knowing what these words mean, and always having heard them spoken correctly, there is no temptation to say, Papá se sienta en la sala y lee el periódico. They've always known only one way to pronounce these words, and there's no way that seeing them in printed form is going to tempt them to pronounce them inauthentically. Finally, taking advantage of the same representative images with which the students are already very familiar, and knowing that they'll already know how to form the particular sentence which will correspond to the series of images they're seeing on the screen, I finally expose them to the word in written form with the goal of them reproducing it in writing. And this is typically only after an entire year of oral instruction, or almost a year of oral instruction. Now, to summarize the steps again of the natural language acquisition sequence, they're as follows. First, a visual presentation of vocabulary. Second, teaching and drilling a gesture to represent that vocabulary. Thirdly, associating a still representative image with that particular vocabulary word. Fourthly, teaching sentence structure by placing that image in a series in relationship to other already recognized images, all of which are linked to a sound file. Fifthly, developing linguistic reflexes through the use of accelerating PowerPoint presentations. Sixth, honing conversational skills through discussing movies and our own personal life experiences. Seventh, phonics instruction and reading practice. And then finally, written instruction, generally after roughly one entire year of principally oral interaction. So, when do teachers know that it's safe to begin to introduce the written word to their students? In other words, when can we recognize that our students have attained relative oral fluency? Well, I promised that that's the next topic in the next video, and so it shall be. I hope you can join me. Goodbye.